everyone, I'm your host Dave, and this is Zilog and Moto, the show where we take things back to the 80s and 90s and go in-depth on the 8 and 16-bit Sega library. Part of that library consists of 302 Master System games that I've picked out. And for those of you Americans watching, yes, there were that many games released for the Master System, they just weren't released here in the United States, with the vast majority instead coming from PAL territories. Of course, that makes trying to collect them while living in the United States a pain, because it means a lot of eBaying and international shipping, but it's getting there, even with all the current delays due to the ongoing health crisis. I did have one unfortunate incident where a Brazilian seller completely ghosted me on a copy of FIFA, but at least that's a game that I feel confident that I'll be able to find another copy of. Having said that, we are not looking at a soccer game on today's episode. But it is sports time again, and I picked a game that actually was released in the United States, although pretty late in the Master System's lifespan in this country. Due to the Stanley Cup playoffs starting up right now, I thought it would be a good time to look at a hockey game on the console for the first time. And while there are a couple, I actually only own one right now, and that game is Slapshot. Slapshot was released in 1990 everywhere but Japan, as Japan was pretty focused on the Mega Drive at that point. When was it released in 1990? I have no idea. Everywhere I checked only listed the year of release, and I couldn't even find a month to go with it, much less a date. I guess it didn't make that much of a splash at the time. However, due to it being a later release in the United States, it is a bit of a rare title to find over here, so if you're looking to grab it for your collection, expect to pay a little more than your average Master System sports title. I think I paid $20 or $25 when I picked it up a few years ago, so nothing crazy. It's not Alf or Power Strike or anything like that. So what exactly is Slapshot, as it's not associated with Sega's other ongoing sports franchises, even in a loose way, like how Reggie Jackson Baseball could be considered a precursor to Tommy Lasorda Baseball? Well, it's not a licensed sports title based on the Paul Newman comedy Slapshot from 1977. But you probably realize that. Instead, what it actually was is a clone of the NES version of Blades of Steel, developed by Senritsu Dinky, a company that was subcontracted to Sega to produce games for their consoles. Now, how or why did Slapshot come into existence? That's hard to say. I don't know if Sega told Senritsu, hey, this game's really popular on the NES, why don't you make a version of it for us? Or if perhaps Sega had plans to license the game from Konami, as it did start out life as an arcade machine before hitting the NES, similar to how Sega licensed versions of Ghouls and Ghosts, Mercs, etc. from Capcom, but then at the last minute Konami reneged on the deal, causing Senritsu to change the name and details to make it just different enough to not get sued. Either way, it's impossible to look at Slapshot and not think of Blades of Steel. So, having said that, is Slapshot better than Blades of Steel, considering the much more powerful hardware available to the Master System? Or did Senritsu really half-ass things, creating a game that's just a shadow of the original? And regardless of how close it is to the original, is it worth your time? Well, I'll try to answer all those questions, but first, a look at the package, and something you may not have ever seen on a Master System release before. Okay, here is Slapshot, and this case is physically in pretty great shape. Certainly not perfect, because if you look close you can see some minor scratching here and there, and then on the spine it's got a small puncture, but those are minor details. Along with the case looking good, the hang tab is intact at the top, and I always like to see that, especially on Master System titles, because they more or less should all look like that. As far as the inner cover goes, it gets a little trickier to judge. Based on what I was able to find on the internet, this is how the cover is supposed to look. And I'm sure you at home looking at it on the video probably think it looks pretty normal. However, the reason why I'm bringing this up is because the colors seem to be a little light. Look at the sports logo in the corner. See how it's a orangish red? And then as I flip over to the back, the borders for the two boxes at the bottom are done in a similar color. Well, at first I thought this might be due to sun bleaching, and having the natural dark red turns a bit lighter. But it appears this is just a printing issue, and it's normal for it to be that color. So if you're out looking for a copy, and it doesn't exactly match, say, Reggie Jackson Baseball, that's totally normal, and it shouldn't dissuade you from picking it up. As far as the rest of the front cover goes, you can tell by the rest of it that this is a later Master System release, as we've got some nice art on the front with a kind of cool concave appearance. I like this cover a lot, although it does look a little awkward for the offensive player to be facing front instead of at the goal he's shooting at. Minor detail, and even with that oddity, it's tons better than the art on earlier Master System covers. Flipping over the back, and it's a pretty standard Master System rear cover, with a line of 4 screenshots on the left side, and some decent flavor text on the right. Screenshots are of good quality for the era, and they did a good job of picking 4 with a nice variety of action. However, I do have to call one thing out. Notice how it says 3 modes, 2 exhibitions, and tournament in the boxes at the bottom? Well, this is a bit of a cheat because it's including 1 and 2 player exhibition as 2 different modes, and there aren't 2 separate exhibition modes. As we open the box, you'll see something very special that you may not have seen before if you've only ever played US Master System games, and that's the fact that Slapshot has a blue label. There's a few Master System releases with blue labels, but they're pretty rare, and normally they only exist for games that Sega had re-released. But it should be noted that specifically in the case of Slapshot, the blue label means you have the US version, and a red label means you have the European version, as Slapshot only came in a blue label in the United States. The manual is in really good shape, like the rest of the package, and just another oddity to note, the paper used is the rougher paper Sega used for the European manuals, as opposed to the glossy paper that you're probably used to seeing. It's a good manual with lots of pictures and text, and it probably over-explains the game if anything, as it's not that complicated. But I'm certainly not going to complain about that. Okay, that's the slightly unusual packaging for Slapshot. Let's get to the game and shoot some pucks. I mentioned in the intro that Slapshot more or less exists as an alternate version of Blades of Steel for the NES. When I first read that comparison online, I was a bit surprised, and even more so when the comment also included ice hockey on the NES. The ice hockey bit is a stretch. I don't think the two games resemble one another at all, except for perhaps the playstyle and the horizontal rink presentation. But Blades of Steel? Well, admittedly, not being an NES kid, it's one of those seemingly ever-present games that people bring up when discussing the standout titles from the NES Sports Library that I've managed to never play, so I didn't really have a point of reference to make that comparison. But one quick trip to YouTube to check out a playthrough of Blades of Steel, and it's crystal clear that it was the inspiration for Slapshot. Both games present the game of hockey from a horizontal viewpoint, with the players primarily skating left and right to move the puck up and down the ice. Both games have a simplistic control scheme, with one button being used to pass the puck to the nearest teammate, and one being used to shoot. Both games feature fights that occur randomly when players check one another, with the loser of the fight going to the penalty box. And finally, both games have the exact same play structure, with your options either consisting of playing an exhibition game against the computer or a second player, or competing in one of 3 8-team single elimination tournaments, which each of the groups representing easy, medium, or difficult in competition from the computer. So to say that Slapshot is at least a clone of Blades of Steel in game structure is wholly accurate. If one or two of those elements had been the same, fine. I mean, they both are hockey games and should resemble one another somewhat. But I think when I saw that they had the exact same tournament structure, with Blades of Steel using US cities and Slapshot using countries, national teams, actually not unlike what we saw previously with NHL hockey and EA hockey in episodes 17 and 20, that cemented it to me that Slapshot was unfortunately just a knockoff, which was a bit disappointing to see. And adding insult to injury on this realization was the fact that Slapshot wasn't even a good copy of Blades of Steel. So far on this channel, when a game has been released for both the NES and the Master System version has always been far superior. Now, granted, I still have a lot of Master System titles to review, so I don't expect things to always be like that, but when comparing titles like Wonder Boy to Adventure Island, or Rampage, or Gauntlet, it simply hasn't been close, and the Master System version has shown off its more advanced hardware. Slapshot came out a year after Blades of Steel, and it has less detailed graphics, a simpler fighting system, and no attempt at the referee speech that Blades of Steel had. Frankly, I'm mystified. There are a few things I like better about Slapshot, such as the arrow system to indicate who you're controlling, instead of the incessant white flashing, and Slapshot has a wider color palette, but other than that, Master System players certainly got the inferior version of the game. But all of that is just a comparison between Slapshot and Blades of Steel. What about Slapshot itself? Just because it's an inferior copy of a well-known game, that doesn't necessarily make it a bad game, right? Well, let's talk about that. First, the game modes. As I mentioned before, Slapshot has two modes, an exhibition mode where you can either choose a team and take on the computer or a second player, or a tournament mode featuring a single elimination 8-team tournament for the championship. The game in total has 24 different teams spanning 3 different classes, A, B, and C, with C being the easier competition and A being the hardest. When playing a game, you will always play teams from the same class to keep things fair. But even in each class, each team is rated on 3 categories: power, speed, and balance, with power being how hard your players hit, speed being how fast they skate, and balance being how well they can take a hit from other skaters and still retain the puck. Each player on a team has the same rating, and there's no real difference between a defenseman and a wing or center, so you don't have to worry about who on your team is controlling the puck. It's not very realistic, but for a game this simple, it works, and we're still about a year and a half before NHL hockey on the Genesis. The team ratings don't make too much of a difference when playing, but it's still nice that they thought to include that, so that there would be more that separates the teams than just the colors or what their coach looks like. Oh yeah, and kind of a fun detail, each team has a different looking coach that appears in the break between the second and third period to give a pep talk to the teams based on how they're doing. This replaces the Jumbotron advertisements that Blade of Steel had. Wouldn't really make sense for Slapshot to show an ad for Contra, I guess. If you choose to go after a tournament rather than playing an exhibition match, you'll again pick a class and then a team from that class, and then the computer will randomly assign teams to the tournament ladder, and then you progress as you will through the tournament. The other winners are randomly generated as well, so no 2 tournaments are ever the same. There's no saving or passwords involved, so if you want to win a tournament, get ready to play 3 games back to back. In some games, that might be an issue, but in Slapshot, the matches average between 15 and 20 minutes, depending on how much scoring is going on, so it's perfectly reasonable not to have a save or continue option. Being able to pick up the game for an hour, accomplish something, and then put it down, I think, is a perfect length to not get boring. Sure, it would be nice to have a season mode or a more involved tournament, but considering the age of the game and its somewhat arcade nature, I think the single player mode is just fine, and you can always go back and try to win the championship with a different team. And definitely no one is stopping you from battling all day with a friend if you want to arrange your own best of 7 tournament or something like that. As you might imagine, the game controls pretty simply, with a button for shooting and a button for passing or switching players. The controls in the game are good, for what they are, and I certainly never had any complaints about actually playing the game, with one minor gripe. Passing the puck doesn't always work as you would expect. Sometimes if you try to pass, nothing happens, and this is usually because the computer thinks that the player you're trying to pass to is covered. But then other times, when you pass, it doesn't go to the player you think it should go to, which is a great way to kill a fast break. It's minor, I know, and since all the players are the same, I usually just end up not passing, but it would be nice if the passing system worked a little bit better. As opposed to a passing system being somewhat mediocre, the shooting system works really well, and when you score on a shot, it's always a great feeling, especially in the Class A games, where the defenses are faster and it's more difficult to get open in front of the net. On defense, the player switching system works a lot better, and usually pressing the pass button is going to put you in control of the player nearest the puck. Your goal is more or less to play bumper cars with the player who has the puck in an attempt to get them to lose control or make a poor pass. This works pretty well, and there's also the added excitement that sometimes when these checks happen, a fight will break out. As I mentioned earlier, the fighting system in Slapshot isn't very good and comes down to a rapid button press competition, which is fine in Class C or maybe B, but in Class A, forget about it. Just plan on having to play shorthanded if a fight breaks out. For times like this, and just playing the game in general, the key to winning games is solid goaltender play. When your opponent is on offense and has the puck solidly in your section of the screen, you simultaneously control the goalkeeper and the defensive player. This sounds a bit awkward, but in reality you learn to just focus on moving the keeper up and down to be in position to block shots. This actually works extremely well, and I get to the point where, even on Class A games, the only time the opposition would score would be when I screwed up and was out of position, or the rare occurrence when you would block a puck and it still dribbled through. From a graphics standpoint, I've already mentioned that I was a bit disappointed in how Slapshot looks. I understand it's an 8-bit title, but it doesn't look much more advanced than, say, Great Hockey, which came out 3 years before. Now, certainly, it does look better than that title, but it doesn't look 3 years better. I do like the small touches, like the animated sequences when you score, which Blades of Steel did not have. But there's tons of same-line flickering that's common on Master System titles, and it's a little awkward to mix a 3/4 view of the players with a top-down view of the rink, i.e. the rink is the same size at the top as it is at the bottom. The aspect ratio of the rink is minor, to be sure, but if Blades of Steel could get it right, why couldn't they? Slapshot isn't very impressive from an audio perspective either. The background music in the game is fine, but in a divergence from Blades of Steel, there's music the entire time you play, as opposed to just on certain screens. This is okay, and I like how the upbeat tempo of the music adds a bit of excitement to the gameplay, but it can get a bit repetitive, and there's not a ton of variety in the music. The sound effects are just okay as well. You're going to hear a lot of shing and thunking, representing the players moving on the ice and the collisions and the body checks. It would have been nice to hear a bit of even admittedly poor speech, like the ref shouting goal as opposed to just the goal horn, which is more of a low-pitched beep. Slapshot is a mediocre game by 1990 standards, and after playing it, I'm still left with a question of why it exists. The Master System was on its deathbed in the United States in 1990, and a middling ripoff of Blades of Steel wasn't going to fix that. It's not a bad game, and I had some fun playing it this week for the review to get footage for this video, but unless you were playing it one-on-one with a friend, I can't imagine why anyone would attempt it to beat it multiple times. It just feels like a weekend rental, or just a game that's going to end up sitting on your shelf collecting dust. Because it features solid gameplay, I'm going to give Slapshot 2 stars, but with the caveat that this rating is only for people who like video hockey. Anyone else should probably give this a pass. You're not missing much. Okay, and that was Slapshot, a game that gave me a major headache when trying to record the footage for this video, because it seems like my copy might have some issues. Or perhaps my backup Genesis doesn't like my power base converter. I'm not really sure which. There's nothing like playing a mediocre game for 20 minutes and then having it freeze up with garbage all over the screen and having to start over, which happened multiple times. Hopefully there's nothing actually wrong with my backup Genesis, because my primary Tower of Power is out being recapped. Not because anything's specifically wrong with it, but because I've still got about 1,200 games to review, and I need it to last. But speaking of the Genesis, I'll be back reviewing a game for it next week, and it's one I played briefly as a rental eons ago. And I seem to remember liking it, but it's one that I'm definitely looking forward to playing again and getting a fresh look at, as I've had a thing for video pinball titles recently. Pro tip, if you're interested in Stern Pinball Arcade for the current generation of consoles, make sure you pick up a physical copy, as it's cheap and the digital version is missing the AC/DC table due to the rights expiring on it. Remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.